You know that feeling when someone looks at you and decides your entire story before you've even opened your mouth? Yeah, well, buckle up because what I'm about to tell you will make you question every assumption you've ever made about the woman standing in line ahead of you at the grocery store. My name is Sarah Chen, and 3 months ago I thought I understood how cruel people could be. Turns out, I had no idea. But here's the thing about underestimating someone. Sometimes it comes back to bite you in ways you never saw coming. The scars on my left arm tell a story that most people think they can read like a cheap paperback novel. House fire, they assume. Car accident, maybe. Something tragic but ultimately ordinary. Something that makes me a victim worth their pity or their uncomfortable stares. What they don't know is that these scars came from something far different. Something that would make their assumptions crumble faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me start from the beginning. From the day I walked into Henderson Community Center for what I thought would be a simple pottery class. You see, after coming home from my third deployment, I needed something to keep my hands busy. Something that didn't involve weapons or tactical planning, or the hypervigilance that had kept me alive in Afghanistan. Clay seemed harmless enough, soft, malleable, the opposite of everything I'd known for the past 8 years. The community center sat on Elm Street, one of those converted elementary schools that small towns repurpose when enrollment drops. The kind of place where senior citizens take watercolor classes and teenagers reluctantly attend court-mandated community service. I parked my beat-up Honda Civic next to a pristine Mercedes SUV and immediately felt the familiar weight of being out of place. Inside, the Pottery studio buzzed with the soft chatter of middle-aged women discussing their book clubs and their children's college plans. I found an empty seat at one of the long tables, my scarred hands already drawing sideways glances from the woman across from me. She had perfectly manicured nails and the kind of smooth, unmarked skin that spoke of a life lived in safety. Her name tag read Patricia Whitmore, and something in her expression told me she'd already decided exactly what kind of person I was. The instructor, a gentleman named Jim who reminded me of my grandfather, began explaining the basics of centering clay on the wheel. I listened with half an ear, my attention caught by the way Patricia kept staring at my left arm, where the burn scars created a landscape of raised and puckered skin from my wrist to my elbow. Her lips pursed in what I recognized as poorly disguised disgust. During our first break, she approached me with the kind of saccharine smile that meant trouble. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "What happened to your poor arm? Was it a house fire?" Her eyes gleamed with the hungry curiosity of someone who collected other people's tragedies like trading cards. I'd dealt with this question 1,000 times since coming home, and I'd learned that the truth was often more than people bargained for. So I gave her the same answer I gave everyone. Something like that. But Patricia wasn't satisfied with vague responses. Over the following weeks, she made it her personal mission to extract my story, each question more invasive than the last. She'd corner me by the kiln, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "You know, Sarah, my cousin works at the burn unit downtown. She says they have wonderful support groups for people with trauma, people who've been through household accidents." The word accident always carried extra weight when she said it, like she was doing me a favor by not pressing for details about my obvious carelessness. Other class members began to treat me like a cautionary tale. They'd glance at my scars and then at their own unblemished skin, probably thinking about fire safety and checking their smoke detectors. I became the object lesson that made their safe, suburban lives feel more precious by comparison. What really got to me wasn't the staring or even the intrusive questions. It was the pity. The way they looked at me like I was broken, like those scars defined everything I was or could ever be. Patricia took it upon herself to become my unofficial spokesperson, explaining to anyone who'd listen that I was recovering from a terrible accident and deserved their patience and understanding. He organized a bake sale to help with my medical expenses, without asking if I needed or wanted help. She spoke about me in the third person when I was sitting right there, as if my supposed trauma had also damaged my hearing. The breaking point came during our 4th week when Patricia brought her daughter Amanda to class. Amanda was home from college, majoring in psychology, and apparently fascinated by trauma cases. She spent the entire session studying me like I was a textbook example, asking questions about my recovery process and whether I'd experienced PTSD from the fire. When I politely deflected her questions, Patricia stepped in with her martyred smile. Amanda's writing her thesis on survivors of domestic accidents. She's just trying to understand how people cope with life-changing injuries. The assumption hit me like a physical blow. Not just that I'd been in an accident, but that it had been domestic. That I was somehow responsible for my own scarring. That I was a victim of my own carelessness or bad luck. I felt my jaw clench, felt that familiar burn of anger that I'd learned to control during my time in the service. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at my scarred arm in the lamplight. These marks told a story, all right, just not the one Patricia and her friend thought they knew. Each raised ridge of skin was a testament to something far different from their suburban nightmare scenarios. These scars came from pulling 2 Marines out of a burning Humvee after an IED explosion outside Kandahar. They came from crawling back into that metal hellscape twice, ignoring the ammunition cooking off around me, ignoring the flames that melted my sleeve to my skin, because Corporal Martinez and Private Johnson were unconscious and no one else could reach them in time. These scars saved lives. But explaining that would mean explaining 8 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and a Purple Heart that sat in a drawer because I'd never figured out how to display it without seeming like I was showing off. It would mean explaining that I'd been a combat medic, that I'd seen and done things that would give Patricia nightmares for months. It would mean watching their pity turn to uncomfortable reverence, which somehow felt even worse. So I kept my mouth shut and let them think what they wanted to think. Until the day everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon, week 6 of pottery class, and Patricia was holding court as usual. She'd brought homemade cookies that she distributed to everyone except me. An oversight, she claimed, though she'd somehow managed to count exactly right for everyone else. She was telling Amanda and 2 other women about a news story she'd seen about apartment fires, making pointed glances in my direction to ensure everyone understood the relevance. "It's so important to have working smoke detectors," she said, her voice carrying that tone of helpful advice mixed with subtle judgment. "And you have to be so careful with candles and space heaters. One little mistake and your whole life changes forever." I was working on a simple bowl, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of the wheel when I heard footsteps behind me. A man's voice, rough around the edges but gentle, said, "Excuse me, miss. I don't mean to interrupt, but is that a 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry tattoo?" I froze, my hands stilling on the clay. On my right shoulder, partially visible where my sleeve had ridden up, was a small tattoo that I'd gotten during my first deployment. Most people never noticed it, and those who did rarely recognized what it meant. I turned to see a man in his 50s, wearing a worn Vietnam veteran's cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His eyes weren't looking at my scars. They were focused on that small patch of ink with an intensity that made my chest tight. "Yes, sir," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The pottery wheel had stopped spinning, but I hadn't noticed until the sudden silence seemed to echo through the room. The man, I could see Frank Morrison embroidered on his jacket, nodded slowly, his weathered face breaking into something between a smile and a frown. "My son served with the 506th, 2nd Deployment, Helmand Province." The way he said it, with that particular combination of pride and pain, told me everything I needed to know before he said another word. "He didn't make it home." Patricia's voice cut through the moment like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, how interesting. Sarah, I didn't know you had military connections. Did your husband serve?" "Is that where you learned about that unit?" She said it with that same hungry curiosity, like she'd discovered a new angle to my tragic story. But Frank wasn't paying attention to Patricia. His eyes had moved from my tattoo to my scarred arm, and I watched his expression change as understanding dawned. When you've served in combat, you learn to read people differently. You can spot the telltale signs of someone who's been in the shit, as we used to say. Frank saw those signs in me, just like I was seeing them in him. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had taken on a different quality, the kind of respectful tone that one veteran uses with another. "What unit were you with?" The Pottery studio had gone completely quiet. Even Jim had stopped demonstrating glazing techniques to listen. I felt every eye in the room on me, felt the weight of a moment that would either expose everything or let me continue hiding behind their assumptions. I looked at Patricia, saw her expectant expression, saw Amanda pulling out her phone probably to record this fascinating development for her thesis. I thought about all the weeks of pitying looks and invasive questions and condescending kindness. I thought about Corporal Martinez, who'd lived because I'd been willing to go back into that burning vehicle. I thought about Private Johnson, who'd gotten married last year and sent me pictures of his baby daughter. And I thought about Frank's son, who hadn't made it home, and how this man deserved better than watching me hide behind comfortable lies. 68W, Combat Medic, 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, I said, my voice steady now, carrying the authority that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. 3 deployments, Afghanistan, 2019 to 2022. Frank straightened, and I watched years fall away from his face as military bearing took over. Without thinking, he came to attention and snapped a salute that was crisp despite his age. "Thank you for your service, Doc." The honorific hit me like a physical thing. In the Army, medics weren't just medics, we were Doc. It was a title that came with respect and responsibility, and the knowledge that when everything went to hell, people looked to you to put them back together. I hadn't heard anyone call me Doc since my discharge ceremony 8 months ago. I found myself returning his salute automatically, muscle memory overriding years of trying to blend into civilian life. When I dropped my hand, I realized that everyone in the room was staring at us with expressions ranging from confusion to shock. Patricia's mouth had fallen open, her perfect composure cracking like a dropped vase. "I don't understand," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You're a veteran? But your scars... You said it was an accident." "It was an accident," I said, turning to face her fully. "An IED accident. The kind that happens when someone buries an explosive device in the road and waits for an American convoy to drive over it." The silence in the room was so complete I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Frank's eyes had moved back to my scarred arm, and I saw him nod slightly, the way one warrior acknowledges another's battle damage. "Those scars," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They tell a hell of a different story than folks been thinking, don't they?" I rolled up my sleeve fully, exposing the full extent of the scarring that ran from my wrist to my elbow. 2nd-degree burns from a vehicle fire. I pulled 2 Marines out of a burning Humvee after we hit an IED outside Kandahar. They both lived. Patricia made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Her daughter Amanda had gone pale, her phone forgotten in her lap. The other women in the class looked like they'd been slapped, their comfortable assumptions shattered in the space of a few sentences. "But you never said," Patricia started. "You never asked," I replied simply. "You assumed, and I let you assume. It was easier than explaining that I'd spent 3 years keeping Marines and soldiers alive in a war zone. Easier than watching you try to process the fact that the victim you'd been pitying could probably save your life if you had a heart attack, stitch up a wound that would send you into shock, or carry your unconscious body out of a burning building." Frank was nodding, his eyes bright with something that looked like pride. "My boy wrote about the medics in his letters. Said they were the bravest people he'd ever seen. running into fire when everyone else was running away from it. We all did our jobs, I said, falling back on the standard response, but Frank shook his head. No, ma'am, begging your pardon, but that ain't just a job, that's a calling. That's the kind of courage that most people can't even imagine. He turned to look at Patricia and the others, his expression hardening. This lady here, she's got more guts in her little finger than most folks got in their whole body, and y'all been treating her like some kind of charity case. Patricia's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a blotchy red that clashed with her carefully coordinated outfit. We didn't know. We were just trying to be kind. Kind? Frank's voice carried the edge of a man who'd spent decades dealing with people who talked about supporting the troops without understanding what that actually meant. Kind would have been treating her with respect instead of pity. Kind would have been asking questions instead of making assumptions. Kind would have been recognizing that someone who's obviously intelligent and capable might have their own story instead of deciding what that story was going to be. I watched Patricia struggle with this new information, saw her trying to reconcile the woman she'd been pitying with the combat veteran standing in front of her. It was like watching someone's entire worldview crumble in real time. The bake sale, she said weakly. The fund for your medical expenses. I have excellent VA coverage, I said dryly. My medical expenses are handled. But thank you for the thought. Amanda finally found her voice, though it came out as a squeak. My thesis. I've been writing about trauma victims and domestic accidents. Might want to change your focus, I suggested. Maybe look into military medical personnel and how they transition to civilian life. Though you'll find that most of us don't consider ourselves trauma victims. We consider ourselves people who've done a job that needed doing. Frank laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Trauma victims? Jesus Christ, ma'am, no offense to your daughter, but she's got about as much understanding of trauma as I got of quantum physics. He looked back at me with respect that felt like sunlight after months of shadow. What you got there are battle scars. Honorable scars. The kind that come from putting other people's lives ahead of your own safety. And anyone who can't see the difference needs to get their damn eyes checked. The Pottery studio remained silent except for the soft whir of ventilation fans. I looked around at these women who'd spent weeks treating me like a cautionary tale, saw them trying to process the fact that their assumptions had been not just wrong, but insulting. Patricia opened and closed her mouth several times before finally managing to speak. I'm so sorry. We had no idea. If we'd known you were a hero... I'm not a hero, I said firmly. I'm a medic who did her job. The heroes are the ones who didn't come home. Like Frank's son. Frank's expression softened when I mentioned his boy, and I saw the grief that he carried every day. My son wrote about you medics in every letter. Said y'all were the reason he felt safe over there, knowing that if something happened, Doc would come for him. His voice broke slightly. Even at the end, the medic stayed with him, made sure he wasn't alone. The weight of that trust, the responsibility that came with being someone's last hope, settled on my shoulders like a familiar burden. It was why I'd become a medic in the first place. Why I'd re-enlisted twice. Why I'd kept going back into danger even when every instinct told me to run. Because somewhere, a scared kid like Frank's son was counting on me to be better than my fear. That's what we do, I said simply, and Frank nodded like I'd just confirmed something he'd always known. Patricia was still struggling, her world of neat categories and comfortable assumptions in complete disarray. But why didn't you tell us? We would have... What? Treated me differently? I asked. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. I didn't want to be your military charity case any more than I wanted to be your burn victim charity case. I just wanted to make pottery and be left alone. But we were trying to help, Amanda said, her voice small and confused. We thought you needed support. Frank turned to her with the patience of a man who'd spent years explaining things to young people who thought they understood the world. Young lady, you want to help a veteran? Treat them like a normal human being. Don't assume they're broken just because they've seen things you haven't. Don't assume they need your pity or your amateur psychology. Most of us just want to get on with our lives. I watched Amanda absorb this, saw her mentally revising whatever assumptions she'd built her thesis around. It occurred to me that this might be the most valuable lesson she'd learned in college so far. "I feel so stupid," Patricia said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she actually sounded genuine instead of performative. "All those things I said about accidents and carelessness." "You made assumptions based on limited information," I said, surprised to find myself feeling something almost like sympathy for her. It's human nature. But maybe this will help you remember that everyone has a story, and most of the time, it's not the story you think it is. Frank was studying my scarred arm again, his expression thoughtful. "How long you been home, Doc?" 8 months, I said, still adjusting. He nodded knowingly. "It takes time. Different kind of mission, civilian life, different rules, different objectives. Sometimes harder than the desert, in its own way." He was right, though I hadn't expected him to understand that. Coming home from war wasn't like flipping a switch. You didn't just stop being a soldier because you changed uniforms. The hypervigilance, the need to constantly assess threats, the way you automatically counted exits in every room, all of that stayed with you. And the hardest part was that civilians expected you to just be grateful to be home, as if surviving was the only thing that mattered. "The pottery helping?" Frank asked, gesturing toward my abandoned bowl on the wheel. "Some," I admitted. "Keeps my hands busy. Gives me something to focus on that isn't—" I gestured vaguely, not sure how to explain the way my mind sometimes wandered to darker places when it wasn't occupied. "I get it," Frank said simply. "I took up woodworking after I came back from Nam. Something about creating instead of destroying." Patricia cleared her throat, drawing our attention back to her. She looked like she was about to cry, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. "Sarah, I owe you such an enormous apology. We all do. The way we treated you, the assumptions we made, it was inexcusable." "You didn't know," I said again, though I appreciated the genuine remorse in her voice. "But maybe next time, before you decide someone's story for them, you might try asking them about it instead." "The bake sale money," she said suddenly. "We raised almost $300. If you don't need it for medical expenses, maybe, could we donate it somewhere? In your honor? Or in honor of your unit?" I was quiet for a moment, thinking. $300 wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it could make a difference in the right place. "There's a nonprofit that helps veterans transition to civilian careers. They could use it more than I can." Frank smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "That's a good choice, Doc. Help the next generation of warriors find their footing." Amanda had been unusually quiet, but now she spoke up. "Sarah, would it be appropriate for me to interview you? For my thesis, I mean, but with a completely different focus. About the transition from military to civilian life and how people make assumptions about veterans?" I considered this. Part of me wanted to say no, to maintain the privacy I'd been fighting to preserve. But maybe there was value in telling the real story, in helping people understand that veterans weren't all broken heroes or ticking time bombs. Maybe we were just people who'd done a difficult job and were trying to figure out what came next. "Maybe," I said, "but not as a case study or a specimen. As a conversation between two adults about complex issues that don't have simple answers." She nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. I realize I've been approaching this all wrong. I was looking for neat categories and clear outcomes, but real life isn't like that, is it?" "No," I said, "it's not." Jim, who'd been quietly observing this entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I hope you'll continue with the class. Your work has been excellent, and I'd hate to lose a student over a misunderstanding." I looked around the room at these women who'd spent weeks treating me like a victim, saw them looking back at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Shame, certainly. Curiosity, probably, but also something that might have been respect, which was more than I'd expected. "I'll think about it," I said, though I was already pretty sure I'd be back next week. Despite everything, I'd enjoyed working with the clay, and running away from uncomfortable situations wasn't really my style. Frank extended his hand, and when I shook it, his grip was firm and respectful. "It's been an honor meeting you, Doc. My boy would have liked knowing there were people like you watching out for his buddies." "The honor was mine," I said, and meant it. After he left, the Pottery studio slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The other women were polite but subdued, probably processing their own assumptions and biases. Patricia kept apologizing until I finally had to ask her to stop. As I packed up my things at the end of class, I realized something had shifted inside me too. For months, I'd been hiding parts of myself, trying to blend into a civilian world that felt foreign and uncomfortable. I'd let people make assumptions because correcting them felt like too much work, required too much explanation. But Frank's recognition, his immediate understanding of what my scars really meant, reminded me of something I'd forgotten. These marks on my skin weren't shameful secrets to hide. They were proof of who I was and what I'd done. They were evidence of a life lived in service to something bigger than myself. And maybe, just maybe, they were something to be proud of. Walking to my car that evening, I caught my reflection in the glass doors of the community center. For the first time in months, I didn't automatically adjust my sleeve to hide the scars. Instead, I stood there for a moment, looking at myself, really looking, and seeing not a victim or a charity case, but a woman who'd served her country with honor and was still figuring out what came next. It wasn't the end of my story, I realized. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And maybe, if I was lucky, it would be a chapter where I didn't have to hide who I was or what I'd done. Maybe it would be a chapter where other people's assumptions mattered less than my own truth. As I drove home through the quiet streets of my small town, I thought about Frank's son and the medic who'd stayed with him at the end. I thought about Corporal Martinez and Private Johnson, both alive and building families because someone had been willing to risk everything to pull them from that burning vehicle. And I thought about the woman in the pottery class who'd spent weeks being pitied for her scars, never knowing that those same scars had saved lives and would always be proof of the warrior she'd been, and in many ways, still was. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd call the Veterans Transition nonprofit and volunteer to help other former service members navigate their way back to civilian life. And next week, I'd return to pottery class, sleeves rolled up, ready to create something beautiful with these scarred but capable hands that had once held the power to save lives and still held the power to shape clay into art. Some stories, I thought, are worth telling in full, even when they're harder to understand than the assumptions people prefer to make.